Hello, and welcome back to another episode of General Conference Conversations, the podcast where we have conversations about General Conference. I'm your host, Kearon, and I am very excited to be talking about this talk today. We get to talk about Elder Kearon's talk, God's Intent is to Bring You Home. And this was probably my favorite talk in all of conference. It really stuck with me, and so I'm excited to speak about it today with y'all. As always, I definitely encourage you to read or listen or watch this talk before you come and listen to me talk about it, so you can get your own inspirations and promptings and what stood out to you. I will definitely not be able to cover everything in this talk without just reading it word for word, and I'm not going to do that. So there's so much past what I'm going to be able to talk about today. So definitely give it a read. There's so much packed into this, so many amazing points, and there's just so much. But really, this is Elder Kearon's testimony of the plan of salvation and God's love, and how, the plan of salvation and the atonement are the ultimate manifestation of God's love and God's desire to bring us home, to have us back in his presence. And he kind of starts off with this story about an officer. He was traveling and woke up. He was in a hotel and he was looking out the window, and there was this roadblock that had been set up, and there was a police officer stationed nearby to turn the cars around, and so that obviously they couldn't go through the roadblock. And he said that as the time went on and as more and more people, had to be turned around, he could see that the police officer was taking great satisfaction in the power that he had to block the flow of traffic and to turn people back the other way. And he did not seem very helpful or sympathetic, and he would just shake his head and point in the opposite direction. And he uses this kind of as his analogy, is like this thing that he kind of goes back to a couple of times, of that the Heavenly Father's plan, his plan of salvation, it was not designed to keep you out, but to bring you home. And this is my favorite quote. This is the quote that has stuck with me in the almost 6 months now, that I just I cannot stop thinking about. Pardon my computer going off in the background. He says, "No one has built a roadblock and stationed someone there to turn you around and send you away. In fact, it is the exact opposite. God is in relentless pursuit of you. He wants all of his children to choose to return to him, and he employs every possible measure to bring you back." And I have absolutely adored, having that come back to me and being able to talk about that with other people, right? God is in relentless pursuit of you. And I've talked about this a couple of times, that turns of phrases like that really stick in my brain. And it really did this time. It was so sticky. It just stuck so much, and it gives so much hope. And it is a very hopeful sentence, a very hopeful message, that not only does God give us everything that we need to be able to return to him, and give us all of the tools, he is also actively working to bring us home. It's not just here's everything, I'm sending you off, here's all that you need, call me if you need anything. right? He is actively trying to pursue us. He wants us to return to him, and he's doing everything that he can to have that happen. And I think about, I don't know, like, you're sending your kid off to college, right? You give them everything you can. You've taught them and raised them up to this point, and do you just never call? Do you never answer their calls? Do you never check in and see how they're doing and if they need anything? No, like, you would call and say, okay, have you check in, make sure that they're doing okay. Are you sick? Do you have all your groceries? Did you forget to or remember to pay your rent? Right? Not to an alarming degree or anything, but you are going to check in. You're going to make sure they're doing okay. And our Heavenly Father is just like that. And I really, really loved, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this talk in Relief Society. And we spend the majority of the time talking about this officer, this story about the police officer. And a couple of questions that the teacher had were really, really impactful. It was a really interesting conversation and then discussion that we ended up getting into. She asked something along the lines of, like, how can we I don't remember how she worded it. It was like, how can we kind of man, this is really gonna bother me that I can't remember how she worded it. She was talking about the officers, like the police officers in our lives, and how we can meet the challenges of those police officers, basically the challenge of police officers like this who kind of turn us around from roadblocks. And then this kind of follow-up question was, how do we not become those police officers for others? And it was interesting because a lot of the ladies thought about it in very different ways, right? One was like, well, those police officers could just be challenges in our lives, right? On a metaphorical level, there are going to be roadblocks in our lives and challenges that we come up against, trials, and there are going to be people who come with those trials, right? And so in that way, meeting those challenges looks very different, and with the help of God, we can meet those challenges and find the detour, right? And then I remember talking, so the teacher had us like kind of break out and just chat with the ladies around us about these questions, and I was sitting next to a friend of mine, and so we were talking about it together, and I was like, there are definitely people, and I've met people in life, whether in the church or out of the church, right, who are like these police officers in many different ways. If they're, whether it's like has to do with the gospel and they just, believe that they know how God is gonna, judge someone or treat someone, or believe that they are the police officer that they have that power to kind of mete out judgments and consequences, or they believe that they have that ability. Or outside of the church, right, where it's kind of the same thing but in a non-religious or in a different religions, right, where it comes from a point of pride and a point of thinking that you know better than everybody else, where that, and it becomes judgment and it becomes mistreatment very, very quickly, and it can be very, very harmful. And I was like, so the way that I've approached those people, or the way that I hope that I would if I ever came across them, is to say, let's take a step back, right? And think about this person that you're talking about badly behind their back, or judging, or even if sometimes it can be really subtle, right? It's not like, I believe this person should be damned to hell. It can be a lot more subtle of like, well, she's just the choices that they're making, I just don't agree, and they're just not gonna make it, and I worry for their salvation, or I worry for their souls, right? We have this kind of it comes from a place of sympathy, and it comes from a place of genuine love sometimes, right? Of like, this has worked for me, this is what I believe is true and right, and so I want this happiness for somebody else, or I want this truth for somebody else. But it veers very quickly into, now I'm judging and I'm controlling, or I'm trying to influence them in some way that is harmful, whether physically or like emotionally, mentally. And so it doesn't always need to be this like contentious way that we talk about people, but also just the way and the tone that we are talking about people's choices, right? We don't get to make choices for other people, as hard as that can be. And I have definitely had to tell people like, hey, you don't know their story, right? Like, take a step back and think about, one, how you would feel if somebody was talking about you like this, right? And also, like, imagine being in their shoes. What's going on in their lives? Sometimes people make mistakes. They make bad choices. And that's kind of the whole point, right? And also, sometimes it's not in their control. Things that are going on in people's lives, they can't control it. They're not in charge of it. It's something that's happening to them, whether they're reacting to it well or not, right? And so being able to take that step back and really remind people of the broader picture, and remind people that these are the people that we are talking about are God's children, who he loves and who he also wants to have back in his fold. And do they need us talking about all of their mistakes behind their back? No, they need us to be loving them and to be their friends and their neighbors and to mourn with them. And then, so we talked about that for quite a while, and that was a really good conversation. And then there was a sister who brought up, I'm trying to imagine being the police officer. And and I was like, whoa, okay, this is great. And so she talked about, like, try to imagine being in the police officer's shoes, right? There is a roadblock, and he's doing his job in redirecting people away from the roadblock, right? He has been given this assignment. And it was a really interesting discussion that kind of spurned from that, of like, okay, we also need to have compassion for the police officer. Like, there are people who are in positions of leadership or whatever who are legitimately saying, there is a roadblock here. You cannot pass. You cannot do whatever because of church policy, because of company policy, because of safety reasons or whatever, right? Like, this is my job, is to tell you that you can't do this. And of course, he does say, like, he seemed to be taking pleasure in it, right? He seemed to be kind of doing a jig and not being very helpful. And so there's just, I loved the nuance of it and all the different ways we were talking about this, because it was like, okay, we need to remind the police officer not to judge. We also need to not judge the police officer so that we become the police officer, right? Like, we're going to be the officer policing the police officer. Like, you don't want that either. And then when we are in those positions of leadership where we have to do that, to remember to stay humble and to not let that power get to our heads, and be able to try and kind of direct people to a detour and be more helpful and more kind. And the last thing that somebody brought up was, she brought up he uses the word blearily, right? He's just waking up in the morning, looking out the hotel window, and he says he looked out blearily. And she's like, I didn't know what that word meant, so I looked it up. And blearily means like that there's kind of water in your eyes, and like your vision's kind of fuzzy, right? You'll like wake up first thing in the morning and you're still kind of waking up, and so you're kind of stumbling to the bathroom, right? And she's like, and he uses the word like he appears to be helpful, or it seemed that he was developing a spring in his step. And she's like, we also need to take it that he was from his perspective, looking from the outside, that he may also not have the full picture of the police officer, right? It could look like he was being very direct and very stern, not very helpful at all by directing people away, when in reality his actions could have looked very blatant and bold and kind of stern, but his words could have been very kind. And he could have been directing them to a detour, or he could have been trying to help them get on their way, right, and explaining what was happening. But he wasn't close enough to know the entire story. And so I really liked that as well, that in all of these situations, right, when there are situations, when there are trials that arise and you're dealing with people, as we all have to do, it's always good to take a step back and take a breath and say, okay, what is everybody's side in this story, right? Let me understand where you're coming from, communicate why you're upset, or why this is happening, or what is going on here that is making everyone so just frustrated, right? And I deal with this almost every day at work. I'm project coordinator, which means that I get to coordinate the project. And so I get to talk to a lot of different people and communicate with them. And almost every day there's a miscommunication of some sort, right? Somebody comes to me and says, well, this person says I have to do this. And I say, well, that's not what I was told. And then I go to the person and they say, oh no, they misunderstood me. Or yes, we have to change it, but here's why. And getting that kind of full context and asking all of the questions and being able to communicate that in a way that makes sense to everybody is definitely a skill that I am still trying to develop, right? But it is that ability to actually to try and step back and see that full picture. And you're not always going to know that, right? When you're hearing someone talk about somebody else, or feeling that you're coming up against a police officer, you're not always going to know the full context of the story. You're not always going to be able to pull everybody into a room, right, and like get everybody to talk and understand the whole story. Not always. You're not always going to get all that full context. It may not be possible, it may not be a smart thing to do, whatever the constraint is, but you can have that empathy, the sympathy, the ability to kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes and think, you know, maybe they're just going through a rough day today, right? And at the same time being able to stand up for someone in that situation. And I think that happened, that in that context as well, when we stand up for someone, we say, hey, like, you don't really know what they're going through. Maybe they'd backtrack and say, oh, that's not what I meant, or, you know, that came out wrong, or no, I didn't know what they were going through. Can you help me? Can I help me to understand? Or you know, thank you for, you know, they may like react really well to that correction, and you get more context to the story that way. And so that's kind of my question, is kind of a melding of those questions they asked in that Relief Society meeting, was how can you lovingly correct the quote-unquote officers in your life and avoid becoming one yourself? And to go along with that, kind of to end here, like I said, there's so much in this talk that I wish I could read. Like, there's so many just amazing passages, but to go along with this, he keeps bringing up this, you know, there are no roadblocks, right? And he talks about the fact that Christ exemplified this when he was on the earth. He says, he did not cast away the woman with the issue of blood. He did not recoil from the leper. He did not reject the woman taken in adultery. He did not refuse the penitent, no matter their sin, and he will not refuse you or those you love when you bring to him your broken hearts and contrite spirits. That is not his intent or his design, nor his plan, purpose, wish, or hope. And I think that is such a beautiful, beautiful reminder, right? As we are realizing that we are the police officers, or that we are trying to remind others who are being like those police officers, Christ welcomes everyone. God welcomes everyone. And he loves everyone. And he wants us to be the best version of ourselves we can possibly be with his help, and to be back home with him again one day. And so just be aware of that, I guess, and think about those questions. Is how can we lovingly correct those in our lives who tend to be more like the police officers, and actually avoid becoming one of them ourselves. So that is all I've got for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening and or watching this episode. I'm so very grateful for all of you, and if you'd like to add to my thoughts, share your own thoughts, absolutely, I'd love to hear them. You can comment below or over on Instagram or Facebook. You can also message me, or my email is in the description of this video if you'd like to reach out to me privately. I'd love that as well, and I will talk to you all next time.